Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. In response to recent tariffs imposed by the U.S. on Chinese goods, China has announced it will reduce the number of American films imported into the world's largest movie market. But even before the recent trade tension, the U.S. and China had a history of disputes over film trade. In 2007, the U.S. challenged China's restrictions on imported films at the World Trade Organization. In 2012, a governmental agreement led to an increase in the number of foreign films allowed in China and improved revenue-sharing terms for foreign studios. The relationship peaked in the middle of 2010s, with significant collaboration and China becoming an essential market for American blockbusters. However, with China's growing suspicion of foreign influence and more stringent regulations, including speech censorship restricting artistic freedom, the once strong collaboration, including co-production, is increasingly rare. Furthermore, China's domestic film industry has experienced significant growth in both the quantity and quality of its productions. Chinese films have gained popularity with local audiences, leading to a decrease in the market share of Hollywood movies. In 2024, American films accounted for less than 10% of China's box office, a significant drop from previous years. To further understand this evolution, we're speaking to Payhuan Shiao, founder and CEO of Immortal Studios. A Hollywood native, Peihuan has been at the center of the Hollywood-China filmmaking industry for the last 3 decades. Let's hear his insights into China's film industry and the challenges as well as opportunities for cross-border storytelling collaboration. Welcome, Peihuan. So welcome, Peihuan. We met in Beijing a couple years ago, and now we're both back in the United States.
Yeah. In a good period between US and China, when it was what everybody was just talking about. It seemed to be that these two great powers was going to finally join hands through policies and economic viability and kind of shepherd the planet in a way, but that's all come and gone.
I know. You taught me a ton about the film industry, and that's why we're having the conversation today.
Yes.
Can you share your background and how you get involved in the film industry and, in particular about your father?
Okay, well, why don't we just start there? I was born in a classic Chinese family. My father's name is Xiao Yi, who's considered one of the creators in the martial fantasy, known in Chinese as the wuxia space. So a legendary creator who deeply influenced me, and he was also influenced by his father, Xiao Zichu, considered one of the tiger generals of the Second World War, who defended China during the Second World War, is considered a real life warrior. So a lot of big warrior energy runs in the family. So I've been somewhat influenced by that. A deep classical Chinese education while growing up in Hollywood. Born in Taiwan from parents from mainland China, then I grew up in Hollywood. I actually went to Hollywood High School. So not just Hollywood, eventually the industry, but the physical location as well. So it's kind of an interesting, poignant point today as I now run a multi-platform entertainment studio. My background's actually in politics. The initial background, and where this crossover with the film industry is I was actually in charge of the California Senate Committee on the Entertainment Industry, and also spearheading Pacific Rim trade initiatives on behalf of the state government of California.
And which governor was it at that
This
time?
was Pete Wilson. So it goes way back. My father was obviously a very creative person, so I was interested in storytelling, and all of that came to a head for me when I decided that I wasn't going to run for elective office, that I wanted to pursue something that I actually thought touched people emotionally, socially, and culturally, and that's really through storytelling. So I had some coverage, and I think understanding the economics and the policy implications of the film industry is not only a dream, it's also one of the biggest native industries to the United States that is broadly responsible for what people now call soft power. So there's so many dimensions to that. And my background in the entertainment industry after leaving the political world is I became a serial creator. So I've created multiple stories. for television, for movies, for games, and I was able to license them and sell them to various Hollywood studios. I became an independent producer and then eventually an investor, especially in cross-border things. But where my Hollywood career intersects with the Chinese film industry in the cross-border space is I actually went into this business to unite Hollywood and China, broadly speaking, and I was able to produce the first ever US-Chinese official movie co-production that ever existed.
And what was that? Which
This
film
was
was
a
that?
movie called Restless. This was filmed, made in 1997. The precursor to that, I actually had the backing of President Clinton back then, and his first Commerce Secretary, Ron Brown, with Jack Valenti, the legendary NPAA chairman, and the Senator of California, Ian Feinstein, who supported me. I had this crazy idea when I was leaving politics that I would bring the industries, the creative people of Hollywood and China together. And we succeeded in doing that. And I was given this enormous chance to chair not just a creative, but a policy and an industrial kind of collaboration. And I think that was in 1995. So that led to me like producing movies, the first ever US-Chinese co-production. And then later on, I would do it again. And I had this idea that I wanted to do it at scale. So I had the support of the Motion Picture Association of America, representing all the major studios, and the Chinese government, the Film Bureau. We created a platform called the US-China Film Summit, which I was honored to serve as chair for 7 years. So it was actually my job to bring these industries together at every imaginable level. And I continued my involvement with the film industry at that level, outside of just being a producer, creator, or an investor, to spearhead cross-border collaborations at scale. And I had an opportunity to do that also under the governorship of Jerry Brown, chaired the California-China business initiatives to implement broad collaboration. So look, it runs pretty deep. So I've been a policy person, I've been a politico, I've been a creator, an operator, both in Hollywood and China. So it's something that obviously I've committed my life to doing.
Yeah, and probably there's no better person to do this. So I think you're too humble. The way you describe your father's work, I was also impacted by his work as a child. And the fact that you're turning that history and background into storytelling. It just dawned on me that politics, a big part of it is storytelling. So you're applying the skills that are necessary to try to bring people together and, lead them somewhere. I want to go back to when you say you co-produce the very first US-China film. That was in the mid-90s. Is that right?
We started shooting in 1997. We wrapped, and it was theatrically released in 2000s.
Okay. Describe what was it like during that time in terms of how China viewed Hollywood movies and how Hollywood viewed China at that time.
Wow, this is a great question. I think most people we've kind of lost track of that. But 1997, even when I go back and watch Restless, like there's still bicycles, there's mouse suits. There's a recognizable disparity of power for sure, economically, culturally, socially, technologically. So the impression of someone from Hollywood going to China was, they thought they were doing some kind of third world outreach.
But did they think that okay, this is going to be a massive
No,
market?
everybody saw the money and the potential. So out of this work came like the intellectual property rights agreements, the importation. I was just smack in the middle of all those things. So the Chinese side looked at Hollywood with like, oh my God, with total adoration. Because obviously Chinese civic life was mostly governed by politics and the Cultural Revolution. So China was in a completely different place. And Hollywood was kind of at the peak and zenith of its power. So it was a lopsided conversation, but nevertheless, Hollywood is always in search of new markets. And when you have the world's most populous country opening up, this was something that needed to take place. And of
Yeah.
course, when we met, this I think hit a crescendo when Hollywood Chinese collaboration became what everybody talked about.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
it was actually, and I think that's a pretty natural occurrence, just because Hollywood representing more mature global markets and the number one emerging market, the collaboration between them was a no-brainer. Navigating the very sensitive political and cultural landscape was the hard part.
So there's so much that we can
Yes, we
discuss.
could actually do a whole podcast just about this.
I want to talk a little bit about how each side looks at each other's potential business market, that perspective, but also how did China think about letting Hollywood movies into the Chinese market?
First was caution, because I think that the Chinese authorities rightly understand that film is actually a tool of, let's just use the word propaganda, which is kind of unfortunate, but it's true. So film is understood in its implication on creating impression and context. So I think the Chinese were always really rather concerned about importing Western values into a country that is ostensibly um, a communistic one, or at least a socialist
So
country.
from the get-go, your feeling was that they've always been cautious.
Well, it's always been cautious, but it's also one of learning. Like, well, we want to learn from the best. We want to eventually tell our stories in a very practical level. In order, there was also a lot of money to be had.
Sure.
Because consumers, this is where the Chinese consumer back then was still kind of awed by the golden era of Hollywood, rightly so. There's just so many great creative works. Also, the visual effects, the technology of putting movies together. Also, this aspirational lifestyle at a time when, this was something they aspired towards. So there's a lot of love and a lot of concern and caution, but also a practical need. Hollywood films performing in China was also the Chinese state-owned enterprises.
What was the practical need at that time? Let's just say they're very curious about how films are being made. So in order to learn from Hollywood, what did the government allow the studios from Hollywood to do? Like, was there
They
joint
were allowed to
venture?
distribute. And back then, there was a quota. There still is a quota. Very practically, they also needed to nurture a film industry.
And they wanted their homegrown film industry, right?
I mean, it really depends because we've had different political eras. And I think at different times there was always this tug and pull. There's a love of Hollywood. There's also a fear of Hollywood, of being culturally consumed,
Right.
which, as you know, is always front of mind for many Chinese people, especially the Chinese government. So they created this scheme where Hollywood studios are able to import movies on a revenue sharing basis. Because there's a policy of importing, and then a certain amount of movies. I think in the beginning was like 10 or 20 movies that could actually be imported on a revenue sharing basis. The rest were flat licenses, so that the licensors of these movies don't actually get the full upside. This is still early days. China, the theatrical landscape, this is before streaming. It was really all about theatrical distribution, and there weren't enough theaters. So, this kind of catapulted the entire development of the modern Chinese film industry. And let's just be honest too, there is also a huge amount of visibility that Chinese films created for itself with what's known now as the fifth generation directors. Chen Kaige, Zhang Yimou, Tian Zhuangzhuang, delivering a large volume of just artistically vibrant films that were utterly fresh, and it did take the world by storm,
Hmm.
especially the art film world. So there was also a lot of drive and a lot of excitement for Chinese storytelling that was ostensibly somewhat politicized, because they're often in reaction to their experiences during the Cultural Revolution. There's a lot of bubbling up of sentiments from China.
During that period of time, some of their work was so good and gave the world a peek into
It did.
Chinese life at that time. And there was no filter almost. Would you say that? Like at
No,
that
behind the scenes, it was deep. It was highly filtered. To make a film in China, you just can't say, "Oh, I'm just gonna go ahead and shoot it." It's actually a semi-governmental activity. You have to register the script. Your script has to be approved down to the elements. You need the governmental sponsor. So it's actually a politicized and bureaucratic process of making films. So everything that is eventually seen is actually negotiated and approved
time?
and renegotiated and then litigated, and then so it's actually quite a complex process. So the movies was actually a sign of tremendous openness from the Chinese authorities to kind of deeply reflect their experiences. When I was making my first film, I did not want to make movies about the Cultural Revolution or the disparities. To me, everything about China was already too politicized.
Even back then, you already felt that way.
Oh yeah, it was, and it's still, it's even, it's
It's
hitting
much
new
worse.
levels. Like, not that politics don't matter, but I think politicizing and just examining the things that separate people causes to lose sight of the larger reality is that we're closer and more alike than we're different. So those were the lens, and it was dynamic, it was exciting, it was really interesting because we were all part of a new generation of opening up.
At least there was an intent on both sides to actually, have access to each other, right? Whether it's,
Right. I
yeah.
mean, there was a clear balance, imbalance of power, also
Hmm.
shared by the governments, because during this time, this is America before Iraq, before Afghanistan, before the economic crisis, before before all the other things that have slowly, I think, chiseled away at
Mm.
at at America as this kind of beacon, this ideal or unattainable ideal that had figured things out in this weird black box. But I think that is no longer the common belief.
From the late 90s all the way to the 2010-ish. During that time, how does Hollywood work with China?
Well, they
Hmm.
continue to import movies, and this is where the Chinese government then had to instill a lot of policies. Many of them are still on the books to make sure that any given year, because if they just allowed Hollywood movies to come in, they would have cleaned up. Hollywood movies would have dominated, and they would have maybe got, if an unlimited amount of Hollywood movies were let in, there would be probably no Chinese film industry left.
But let's pause there. Was there a Chinese film industry?
Oh yeah, very much so. There is. So there's two. There's one that's a domestic Chinese film business that's trying to get Chinese eyeballs, and then there's another form of Chinese cinema that's really made for the festival circuits around the world. So those were two things. Sometimes they overlapped, and the best filmmakers are able to straddle that. So that what was happening in China while big Hollywood blockbusters were being imported, and the government was just carefully monitoring it. And this is when they realized that, hey, to really take full advantage of the Chinese marketplace, because this is where the dollars are growing. A few years ago, a Marvel movie can get $5-6 million gross out of China. That's real money. Eventually, it rose to those numbers, and this is where can we tell shared stories? So the idea of co-producing, this is what I did. My first effort was the thesis that if I can craft a story that would be embraced both by Chinese audiences and international, in this case American audiences, by a combination of telling stories that are relevant and interesting to both and casting them in such a way, was that what these types of movies are treated as domestic Chinese films for Chinese purposes. From economics, it made a big difference because then you're collecting about 45% of the box office versus 20-25 from an imported rev share film. So the delta of that 20% can mean the difference between a movie making money or not. Those are the hard economics of it. So against this backdrop, Hollywood wanted to do more, and as China grew and grew and built out theaters, this became more popular. And as the Chinese public markets exploded with an onslaught of publicly traded technology companies, real estate companies, all of a sudden, movies became a way to project soft power and became the head of a train for consumer products, marketing campaigns, movie stars. This is when Chinese capital started considering developing itself at scale, including investing into Hollywood, which many of them did. And I think I probably have worked with just about every large transaction that happened during that time on one side or the other.
So the theaters that are being built out throughout China during that time, was any US business involved or it
Yeah,
was
AMC. There's been a
yes.
few well-known U.S. companies, and then this is where, it's a very different way to operate, especially operate a media company in China. That remains a very challenging thing. But I would say most of the major media and entertainment companies, not I said most, all of them
Hmm.
had a very significant presence in China.
And how did they structure those businesses? Are they joint venture?
First of all, you're not allowed. There was a time when joint ventures were allowed, but the whole category of content creation was not even allowable. So they selectively opened things up to friendly companies. And when DreamWorks Animation established their joint venture in China, they received a one-time license to be able to do that. But even under those circumstances, the foreign partner is 49% or less.
And you're talking about content co-creation. This is about.
Content co-creation and distribution. So there's things that were just flat out not allowed. And that's always a sliding scale. And of course, a lot of people try to skirt it with lots of different creative ways of doing deals. But this was probably the most exciting thing in Hollywood for, I would say, probably 5 to 10 years was China.
And maybe you can help people understand how big of a market are we talking about that excites Hollywood? I mean, is China the largest?
China is right now, this year, 2025, is turning out to be a really spectacular year for China, primarily because of the films that performed really well out of Chinese New Year. There's probably 4 or 5 films that cleared the $200 million grossing mark. Ne Zha, which is a Chinese animation, Ne Zha 2 has now cleared $2 billion in box office, with 90% of that coming from China. So 2025 is turned into a watershed year. China last year was the second largest theatrical box office in the world. This year, we really don't know. When you have a phenomenon like this on your hands,
Yeah.
it changes the dynamic. But here I want to add that the film industry, the entertainment industry, largely in China, is also not a bed of roses. So please don't walk away thinking, oh, just because Ne Zha did this, they're doing well, because it's not.
Hmm.
That the Chinese entertainment industries is also in a crisis mode right now.
In
A
what
lot of
way?
things are performing, but I would say the most challenging thing for creative businesses in China is the regulatory environment is quite stark. If this were a purely market-driven initiative, then I think the entertainment industry would be doing incredibly well. But during this time of tightening messaging control, and remember my earlier point that fundamentally the government still sees these expressions as a political act.
So, can you give one or two examples? What kind of regulations are tightening up in recent years?
Let's just talk about co-productions. There was a time when co-productions were encouraged. Today, it would be very, very hard to pass. For instance, it would be virtually impossible to make the film that I made, Restless, that involved cast and stories from both sides, because the parts would be analyzed through such a strict political lens that every line of dialogue, every cast, every decision would be looked at as saying, who is coming out on top? What are they trying to infer about China, the Chinese people, the Chinese regime? What does it say about the foreign world? So in this kind of environment, imagine you being the Chinese bureaucrat. And a lot of these are my longtime friends. So I'm able to really sit with the decision makers behind closed doors, where we could talk and we could really, nobody knows and nobody wants to make a mistake. And if you made a mistake that puts you on the wrong side of politics, your career is over. Now, who wants to shoulder that through individual films? So that kind of stark environment, people are just going to make very Wolf Warrior like films.
When did you notice this change? This
I think
tightening?
this tightening had been happening over some time, but I would say it started really happening in a very palpable way about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense what prompted that?
I do. Well, it's the changing of the guard, I would say.
Leadership.
It's the tightening of control in China, trying to look backwards. So that coincided a lot of things. And of course, there's been a lot of things done on the American side that doesn't fully invite them to the table as well.
Yeah. Now, I want to also talk about this interesting phenomenon that, you mentioned the Chinese capital going out to start investing in the US, in the film industry, and even theaters. When did that start?
That started, I would say it started in the early 2010s.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
around
I
that
would say
time.
about 2010. to about, I would say, 2016, 17.
Okay.
7 years as the chair of the U.S.-China Film Summit
Yeah.
was truly the golden years of those collaborations, and it was almost like every day another deal would be had. Sometimes pretty crazy deals where companies were valued billions of dollars. Many of them are still around, remnants of it today. Legendary Pictures that was sold for more than $3 billion to Wanda. Many of the Hollywood slates have been supported by Chinese money. AMC, the list just goes on and on and on.
Yeah. And I remember when like Alibaba started a studio business and Tencent as well, and then Wanda as well.
Alibaba's now reemerged. Tencent is kind of in a holding pattern. Now there's a new era of excitement, and I think those challenges notwithstanding, they're starting to see that the big payoffs. So I think this is a new era. We're going to see a lot of Chinese tentpole properties from the martial fantasy space, which is actually where I live, obviously, because this is what I'm building today, an interconnected wuxia universe whose time has really come. That I think that kind of momentum and that kind of commerce is formidable.
Sounds like China already has a very robust domestic film industry and the business.
No,
And
has a potentially robust that is doing very well, being carried by the performance of these top leaders. But aside from these leaders, is still having a very challenging time because you don't have these movies opening every week. There's still a lot of challenges. Again, I just want to say that it's not a bed of roses there. The reality is there's a need for mass entertainment, and that need will continue, and that as Hollywood fades from the public Chinese view, because remember earlier part of our conversation, the government regulators have to keep the Chinese film grosses. They have to manipulate the results to keep it under 50%. But now at full scale, it's very, very hard for a Chinese movie to cross the $100 million mark in China. So what's happened is actually there's been a changing of consumer interest. It's not even a political thing. So I think Donald Trump rightly said, we know that it's part of the things that's on the bargaining table in the trade war is that we're going to reduce the number of film slots. But the reality is the consumers have been voting with their feet for some time.
That's the overall changing tides in the film industry, right? We're not even talking about whether it's China or the US, just overall.
The film industry is now deeply intertwined with short form content, with technology, and I think the waves of transmedia. So it's not just the film industry, but it's the games industry, which is also a gargantuan industry. Films and games and movies are kind of the caboose of IP and creative industries, fashion, apparel, music, lifestyles, food, all of those things that travel with it. So that's why it's not just the film industry, it's kind of a bellwether of where popular sentiment is going. Fundamentally, the question, and I think, is like, what is happening to global pop culture now that superheroes have also vacated the stage?
So what is your answer?
My answer is that the martial fantasy genre, which is a native of China, that has been inspiring generations of people, especially during very difficult times when people feel misaligned, disconnected, disempowered, or living under tyranny. So this need for heroes is very, very persistent. And against the backdrop of, I think, classical Chinese philosophy, lifestyle practices gaining a whole lot of prominence. And people are really waking up to the fact that these are very effective against the modern diseases, whether it's health, whether it's mental. So I think the core elements of Chinese culture, which has not been broadly supported and celebrated, has seeped through and survived through wuxia. And now we're seeing that this is a trend that it's reared its head to the tune of billions of dollars in China. And similarly, it's been embraced by Hollywood. So think about Cobra Kai. Think about what's coming up just around the corner, The Karate Kid. Think about Everything Everywhere All at Once winning the Oscars. 17 awards. Think about Shogun winning 17 Emmys in a historic way. Think about Dark Wukong being the number one video game in the world, then you're starting to see a real trend. So my view is that this is a golden moment for these kind of this new kind of heroic spiritual food that's been tested over thousands of years. It's already taking over global pop culture. And this is also the engine behind all things anime and manga. Also, the Western mind and audience is now has a deeper appreciation and a thirst for cultural, emotional, aesthetic touch points that aren't really scratched by this regurgitation of Snow White again. Let's do Batman the 17th time. Like, we're just yawning already. It's like, what's new, what's different? And importantly, like, how does this impact me? So this is, I think there's a very beautiful moment.
There's a fatigue for regurgitating similar storylines. For example, Netflix and others are acquiring from other parts of the world because there's new tastes, new ideas, new culture.
Driven by Gen Y, Gen Z, which
Yeah.
are the mainstream media consumers of today. So
What are some of the new trends you're observing from the world of China? And how will the trends be the new trends for the world?
well, I think, look, the AI is obviously front of mind, and what
Hmm.
DeepSeek has done, still reverberating throughout. So I think the technological innovations that are coming out of China parallel what's happening and surpasses in other parts. So I think that is something to look for.
And how is that applied to the media and film industry?
Ultimately, I think as a company that's also developing and building in AI, it's transforming traditional workflows and the cost structures. It's fundamentally going to already altering the entire content creation landscape, including China. And in other things that we're seeing that China has become a leader, for instance, for short form content creation and monetization. I think these short reels, there's a lot of people talking about, okay, now let's make complete movies in 3 minutes.
I think one of the newer exports from China is actually those very short films that you just mentioned. And they're kind of like 10, 15 minutes. They're kind of cheesy, like soap opera-y, but very, very popular.
They know they're targeting. I'm trying to do this is a die-hard romance novel. I want to deliver to that, I want to deliver this dopamine hit. So I think they're very, very targeted. But in my view, these don't really have any long time sustainable moats because it's a format. And format people can pick up really, really quickly. So I think the larger opportunity, I think, is differentiated, is a cultural and storytelling differentiation that's fresh, interesting, and engaging.
We're now in the middle of the trade war. China has announced no more Hollywood movies coming into the Chinese market. Is that right?
No, they didn't say no more. They said a reduction.
Oh, just reduction, but there's no official.
He negotiated with Xi Jinping in 2012. He actually got the number of Chinese importations on a revenue sharing basis from 20 to 34. So I think you're going to see that number 34 fall. They left it somewhat open. See if there would be like maybe movie stars or well-known people that will lobby for it. But for reasons I've already shared, I don't think that's a particularly salient number because the market share has been dropping organically, not because of political reasons, because of content and relevance reasons. Those trends will only continue because I think by acts of the American government, people are less and less inclined to feel positively about American culture. With a few breakaways. I know in prepping for this, I think there was this Red Book moment, there was a TikTok moment. So I do think that there is a people-to-people connection that's brewing. But that's on a pure basis, as opposed to we're just going to emphatically like Chinese films or emphatically like Hollywood films. It's like, hey, what does this film have to do with me? Why should I be interested? My time and energy and money is really valuable. So sell me a proposition. So I think, and that's actually a very good thing.
Do you think it'll come to the point that the consumption of Chinese film, media, or related culture in the US will become a political issue?
It hasn't yet. And part of it is because it hasn't happened with such regularity to threaten it. And the things that are succeeding are also not political content. They tend to be more cultural content. Like it's kind of hard to push back against Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or
Or Ne Zha.
like hey, that was cool. I liked it. It had heart. It had emotion. So why would you so? It hasn't surfaced yet, but
Are you worried?
but I do expect that as China and America's differences deepen or their political differences come to a boil, there's going to be heavy-handed maneuvers potentially on both sides that will influence public opinion and as well as I do, at any given time there are a lot of nut jobs out there that's just going to be like it was dangerous to be Asian American in North America during the COVID times. When my mother was going out to do her grocery shopping, I was concerned. So I don't preclude that from happening. It would be unfortunate, but we know that that is also a fact of life. So as things really become challenging, I do expect that there'll be a lot of political and cultural fallout.
Do you think Chinese export of their own media, film, culture, etc., is well received in other parts of the world?
It's a new phenomenon. I would say in 2025, they're killing it. To give you a sense of how Ne Zha, we know Ne Zha did very well in China, and of course it did.
In the US too.
Oh yeah, for China, for this film to clear 20 million, it's beat out a lot of indigenous American films being put together by great cast. Keep in mind, just a few months ago, Apple decided not to theatrically release a George Clooney Brad Pitt movie, Wolves. So the fact that a Chinese language film without a huge PR budget and no one's ever heard of Ne Zha here to get $20 million like that is phenomenal.
I would have never thought that Hollywood would even have a competitor. And do you think China and the US will compete in the film industry?
I actually have a different view of the kind of Hollywood that I like. I think of Hollywood as a global platform for storytelling and content creation, marketing, and distribution. It's kind of an open meritocracy that a lot of people can plug and play. We're seeing that more and more. That's developing alongside political realities that would want to paint it some in other ways. So I think what we're going to see is that we're going to see a lot more global citizens in the content space. If you think about it already, most of the major Hollywood studios are already publicly traded international conglomerates. So there will be competition. The governments will want to frame it like that, but I don't necessarily think that the consumers see it that way. And that's a healthy thing, and I want to encourage more of that. There already are different policies. I think they're going to move those chess pieces around, to optimize whatever political outcome, whatever they're orchestrating. But ultimately, from a consumer level, people just want to see great stories, and wherever they can find them during this time of great challenge for the average person is where they're going to go. Mm-hmm. And that is going to continue to be true, and I would say even more true. So people don't go to the movies or consume entertainment for a political objective.
Yeah, good stories are good stories.
To be taken somewhere, to be shown something.
Yeah. Like I said, stories are universal and they touch every human being just in the same way, regardless of the language, regardless of the production and all
Well,
that.
people are touched in different ways, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also different aesthetics, but I think in this day and age, those are pluses. It is not all things to all people, but people can choose. So I think a lot of people are gonna like movies from China, not because it's from China, but because it's a good film that speaks to them.
That's such a good line. Predictions for the next. I don't even want to go that far. I feel like we're living in a very present time. Maybe just next.
Political realities are changing by the day.
Yes. So let's just say 12 months. For the next 12 months, what are some of the interesting things that will happen in the China world, in the US China world when it comes to film media?
I think there's going to be a holding pattern because most of the commerce that takes place from large companies that aren't like Hollywood is already no longer focused on China. So there isn't, they'll try to do as much as they can, but they're not going to lose any sleep over it because they've already written those hopes down. The Chinese are going to continue to do their singles and doubles from top successes, while the politics of the day will just basically take over. So we're going into a very, very difficult, challenging time, and it's going to get a lot worse.
For creators in particular.
Yeah, it's gonna suck for a lot of people, for the industry and for the dialogue and experiences at large. And usually against this kind of backdrop, there's gonna be some piece of content and stories or groups of people or stories that's going to push beyond that narrative and be successful in spite of the political environment or because of the political climate, and that's kind of where I reside. This is a time for great stories, and particularly stories that emerge from the collective cultural wisdom of the Chinese experience, as a bomb.
For those who don't know that much about wuxia stories, right? Because they just know about it as a martial arts, they thought it's all about the fighting. But the backdrop of all these stories, it's always about this period of chaos. Somehow the government is a mess. Yeah, the government is a mess, the world is a mess, and so therefore
The
they're
hero emerges.
exactly.
The hero emerges, learns, grows, and is able to conquer those things. And of course, I'm also a kung fu practitioner for decades, and I had the chance not only to work alongside my father, but work with the Shaolin Temple as their brand builder. So I've been inside the original kung fu mythology. I just know that there's a lot there. If you look at Bruce Lee's life, his enduring legacy would be his philosophy. That is really Taoism. So wuxia has kung fu in the foreground, but in the backdrop, it's all the elements of this beautiful environment and ideas and philosophies and aesthetics that have been workshopped over thousands of years to bring that kind of satisfaction to the average person, saying, the world is a mess, I'm struggling, how do I get through this?
That's very much the allure of those wuxia novels. When reading those novels, you do admire those people, these individuals.
Because they're you. You're not just admiring them, but the real thing is it's wish fulfillment. It's because
Yeah.
when you're reading that, I don't know what you geek out on, Wenchi, but you're thinking it's me in that role. So what happens to the hero, you're living and experiencing it. And I think it got you through whatever you needed to get through. It certainly did it for me.
And especially it's always comes from nobody.
The underdog.
Yeah, the underdog story, and to be successful in their own context, you have to live an extremely disciplined life. You have to have this incredible values and philosophy, the way of life.
You got to be unstoppable.
Yeah, yeah. Very much needed for this time right now.
Not
So
for everybody. So at Immortal, I've just kind of put on my Immortal founder hat on. Our mission is to awaken the hero in everybody. And I believe that's true to the philosophy, the lineage of wuxia.
well, thank you so much for having this conversation. The Hollywood connection to China has been so fascinating, but somehow it's less covered, compared to other industries
Well, yeah.
these days. Yeah.
These days, because it's already faded from its initial time, but there was a time when every major player in Hollywood.
Everyone was in China. No, I
I'm
remember those
I'm
days.
sure you saw more famous Americans out of fancy Beijing hotels than you would find in the Four Seasons here in Beverly
Yeah,
Hills.
and then all the film festivals, MPAA also set up an
Yeah,
office there. There was just so much, and quickly it also vanished. So quite an interesting story as well. Maybe
the
someone
journey continues. Thank you so much.
As in other facets of US China relations, the film industry is also experiencing a decoupling driven by political and ideological differences, alongside rapid transformations within the industry itself. China is becoming a significant exporter of culture and storytelling across various entertainment mediums, from theaters, live shows, and streaming platforms to gaming. Thanks to technological advancements, including AI, Chinese narratives are gaining global traction. For instance, The recent Chinese animated fantasy action adventure film, Ne Zha 2, has grossed over $2.1 billion, surpassing Star Wars, The Force Awakens, and Titanic, and ranking just behind Avatar in film history. It is also the highest-grossing animated film worldwide. As a powerful form of expression, film could become a stage for political and ideological competition, particularly as the US and China race to shape global narratives. Both countries will probably deploy more tools to assert their influence in this arena. This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next week.